It's the biggest and most recognized news network in the world. For decades, the publicly funded British Broadcasting Corporation has been a journalistic standard-bearer, which is why its recent crisis was such big news. A decision by the BBC's flagship current affairs show, Newsnight, to drop a story about alleged sexual abuse by Jimmy Savile, who was one of the network's most celebrated broadcasters, ripped through the corporation and eventually led to the resignation of its Director General, George Entwistle. If you wanted to write a manual about how not to deal with a crisis, then the BBC's Savile scandal is where you might begin. Editors stepped aside, false accusations of paedophilia were aired, and the repercussions have been felt across the Atlantic, where the BBC's former Director General, Mark Thompson, who was at the helm when the Savile story was dropped, is now CEO of the New York Times newspaper. The Listening Post's Phillips now on the unravelling crisis at the BBC and the bad press it's given itself.
British media's coverage of the scandals at the BBC has verged on the hysterical at times.
Their response has been vitriolic towards the BBC.
The opportunity to have a go at the BBC has been one that they have seized with great alacrity.
Any reason they can find to be negative about the BBC, they will.
The biggest television news organisation in the world. A British institution, 17,000 employees under the microscope because of one programme, Newsnight, and one former employee, a man named Jimmy Savile.
Welcome to January the 1st, 1964.
The importance of Jimmy Savile is that he was a star that the BBC made. Having made Jimmy Savile, the BBC's kind of responsible for what Jimmy Savile did.
ITV ran a documentary exposing Savile as a paedophile, which is something the BBC should have done and could have done.
It's obviously embarrassing for the BBC that they had the story. They decided not to transmit it for certain reasons, but that a rival station found the time and the resources to actually investigate the story fully and found a story that was worth transmitting.
But let's be fair to the BBC. Number one, Panorama, BBC's flagship current affairs program, did a damning film about Newsnight.
How did one man harm the entire society?
How many media organisations in the world allows one of its programmes to attack another of its programmes? I think the BBC accepts that it made a massive error, the Newsnight programme made a massive error, and it's now bending over backwards to interrogate itself.
But not always helping itself. When Newsnight tried to rectify the situation, it ended up broadcasting another film that made serious allegations about an alleged paedophile. It turned out to be a case of mistaken identity.
A new crisis for Newsnight. Tonight, this programme apologises.
Someone had to face the music. It was the Director General. On November 10th, George Entwistle went on the record to try to defend the organisation, but he just wasn't up to the job. After only 54 days in post, Mr. Entwistle fell on his sword.
Good morning, this is Today with John Humphreys.
The interview between George Entwistle, then the Director General, and John Humphreys on the Today programme was the most painful interview I have ever heard.
You didn't know that that actually happened?
No, I'm afraid I didn't.
He was incredibly honest, but in the process revealed that he didn't seem to know what was going on, and I think in the end that did for him.
The first organisation to leap to hold itself to account has been the BBC.
The worst crisis that I can remember in my nearly 50 years at the BBC.
Entwistle's failure to get to grips with the details of the crisis were exposed not by a rival broadcaster or a rival newspaper, but by a BBC news programme.
If the BBC was going to get any credit for self-scrutiny, it wasn't coming from rivals and the profit-driven press, who jumped on the story about an organisation that they say benefits unfairly from public funding. The Murdochs have been going after the BBC for years, arguing the state broadcaster is an unfair competitor for everyone else.
The scale and scope of its current activities and future ambitions is chilling.
Murdoch-owned papers are thrilled to see the BBC suffer and welcome the distraction the BBC is providing from News Corp's own in-house scandal.
I don't think the comparison to Rupert Murdoch and the hacking scandal is quite fair against the BBC, because actually this is a crisis spurred by a couple of incidents of yes, poor news practice and bad decision making. The hacking scandal, on the other hand, is systemic of poor journalistic practice and behaviour. They're in two different camps, really.
But at the end of the day, you've had the editor of Newsnight stand aside, you've had the head of news and deputy head of news stand aside, you've had the director general stand down within a few weeks of taking charge of the BBC. Compare that with News International News Corp, where Rebecca Brooks, the chief executive, clung on for dear life, and you have Rupert Murdoch, a man who is still chief executive and chairman of News Corp. All we've had from Murdoch was one day in front of a select committee.
This is the most humble day of my life.
But he's still in his job.
As is the new chief executive officer at the New York Times, for the moment at least. Mark Thompson was George Entwistle's predecessor, Director General at the BBC at the time the Savile expose was shelved. He happened to start his new job in New York, just as the scandal was breaking in London. According to Mr. Thompson, he knew nothing about it.
We're asked to believe that Mark Thompson himself did not know about these allegations while he was at the BBC. So this has become an issue for him as the chief executive of the New York Times. I revealed that he had asked lawyers to send a letter threatening to sue the Sunday Times magazine if they published allegations about underage sexual abuse at the BBC. How could he have authorized them to threaten the Sunday Times if he had not actually read the letter himself, in which case he did know about the allegations at the BBC? This has resulted in a story in New York magazine headlined "Why Mark Thompson Didn't Know What Was in the Letter from Mark Thompson."
I think there will be a great sense of panic at the New York Times right now. Interestingly, the New York Times itself and its public editor has run some pretty harsh stuff about what Thompson has to do and what he has to say in order to regain credibility and trust on this. It would be ironic if the Director General of the BBC, who succeeded Thompson, lost his job within 54 days, and Thompson loses his job at the New York Times in fewer than 54 days.
That would be two of the best-known media brands in the world damaged by the same scandal. The BBC is primarily funded by a taxpayer's licence fee paid by every television viewer in the country. The Conservative government froze the BBC's funding 2 years ago. In real terms, that's a 16% cut. It was a risky thing for the government to do. A poll taken last year revealed that 59% of Britons see the BBC as the most trusted media organisation in the country. No other organisation got more than 10%. And so, for all of its troubles, for all of its critics, the BBC remains extraordinarily popular with ordinary Britons. That's something the government must bear in mind in 2016, when the BBC's charter is up for renewal and the organisation's future will be determined.
The future going forward for the BBC has to be about forging a much clearer relationship with their public, understanding what the public wants them to do. And on the whole, that requires them developing a bit more grit.
The BBC has been reminded in the last few weeks that whilst it does many things to entertain the British public, whilst it does many things to educate them, its primary responsibility is to inform. And that means that the jewel in its crown, its journalism, is also its Achilles heel. If the BBC is to be trusted, respected and admired, as it is by the British public and around the world, then it must at all times maintain rigorous scrutiny and the highest conceivable standards in its journalism, both at home and abroad.
2016 is a big year for the BBC, and it will be covering its own story.